Slobodan Milosevic, former president of Yugoslavia and Serbia, is now in the dock. The first head of state to be tried by an international court for war crimes and genocide. Milosevic had driven whole communities from their homelands to make way for his fellow Serbs. His forces had murdered thousands of civilians. The wars he provoked launched the term ethnic cleansing. And they tore Yugoslavia apart. First Croatia and Slovenia, then Bosnia and Macedonia broke away, leaving Serbia dominant in a much reduced Yugoslavia. In December 1995, the same Milosevic, who had been called the Butcher of the Balkans, was welcomed to Paris to sign the treaty that brought peace to Bosnia and the region. Everyone at the ceremony knew that only Milosevic could prevent further Serb aggression. He was the linchpin of the peace.
I didn't have a problem with talking to him. He was quite confident and said he was glad this was over and looked forward to better relations. And I said that I did too. It would depend upon how the Bosnian peace took hold and whether the oppression and killing ended.
Ja sam siguran da je pred nama puna normalizacija odnosa između Jugoslavije i Sjedinjenih Država i jedna intenzivna saradnja.
Back home in Serbia, Milosevic was a hero. Even his wife Mira, a strong supporter of communist China and Cuba, welcomed his newfound friendship with the West.
Da sam smatrala i da sam o tome govorila svima oko sebe, dakle uopšte takva je bila atmosfera u kući, da evo, nadamo se skinuće nam sankcije, nema više rata, otići će izbjeglice ili će jedan veliki broj njih otići. Moći ćemo da gradimo, tako da kažem, jedan svet kroz veliki oporavak i kroz novi koncept razvoja.
Most of the sanctions imposed during the Bosnian War had been lifted. Removing the rest of them depended on how Milosevic behaved in one backward part of his own country. He had come to power a decade before by championing the cause of the Serb minority in Kosovo.
Kosovo nije jedan običan deo Srbije. Kosovo je samo srce Srbije. Čitava naša istorija je na Kosovu. Svi naši manastiri su na Kosovu.
Serbia's claim to its southern province of Kosovo dates back over 700 years. But by Milosevic's time, 9/10 of those living there were not Serbs but ethnic Albanians. Milosevic had shut down Kosovo's parliament and stripped the Albanian majority of their political rights. A small group of Kosovo Albanians responded by setting up the Kosovo Liberation Army, the KLA.
Ne jemi takuar në Prishtinë, jo larg nga këtu. Ne natyrisht u mbledhëm, diskutuam. Ndërkombëtarët nuk do të interesohen fare për Kosovën, por që se ne nuk lëvizëm vetë. Dhe ndërkombëtarët do të lëvizin vetëm atëherë kur ne lëvizum dhe ne krijojmë realitete që ndërkombëtarët e interesohen për Kosovën. Njerëz kemi pasur më tepër sa që kishëm në atë kohë armë.
KLA volunteers, like this law student in Pristina, had to rely on hand grenades.
Natyrisht dhe vendosa vendin ku mund të jetë më efektiv aksioni. Në qendrën e mjekësisë, në atë kohë nuk mësonin shqiptare. Në atë kohë ishte boshatisur shkolla dhe kishin mundshur me refugjat. Kam dalë në rrugë dhe pikërisht aty ku unë kam pasur të kryej aksionin, edhe sot dhe atëherë kanë qenë disa kiosqe të hamburger. Kam hodhur bombën dhe jam kthyer direkt, jam futur në kioskun e hamburgerit dhe kam marrë hamburger. Kështu që kur kanë ardhur policia të tjerë që të veprojnë me drita të kaltra, me shumë të tjera, unë kam dalë nga hamburgeri shumë indiferent tu I hangar hamburger në rrugë. Dhe kam kaluar në mes të policisë.
Tipičan primjer za to su teroristički akti šiptarskih separatista na Kosmetu, više ili manje zavisno od trenutne međunarodne...
Synchronized attacks in 6 towns in Kosovo put the KLA on the map. But without serious weapons, they were no threat to Milosevic. Then an ill wind blew them some good. In 1997, the communist government in neighboring Albania collapsed. Anarchy followed.
Nxjerr prej depove dhe njerëzit kanë vjedh, kanë qenë për shtëpitë e tyre. Sikur të kishim pas njerëzit tonë të përqendruar gjatë thymjes së depove në Shqipëri, ne do të kishim pas mundësi edhe pa para me grumbullu armatime të shumta atje. Pak me vonesë, por kemi shku, do thotë kemi ndërtuar një strukturë njerëzish për grumbullimin dhe blerjen e armëve me çmime të arsyeshme atëherë.
To get the weapons into Kosovo, the KLA revived an ancient method of delivery.
Oni odvedu konje preko granice, natovare ih sa oružjem I puste ih. I oni sami znaju put I dođu kući na Kosovo, gde ih čeka organizacija koja preuzima oružje I nosi po selu. Tako da vrlo malo ubijenih, vrlo malo likvidiranih terorista je bilo u toj graničnoj liniji, jer oni jednostavno nisu ni išli tu. Tu su išli samo tovari.
With their new weapons, the KLA's attacks became more deadly. Milosevic's paramilitary police hit back hard. Early in 1998, they killed 20 villagers in the KLA heartland of Drenica. A few days later, they targeted the home of the KLA's commander-in-chief, who was thought in Belgrade to be behind the murder of several Serbs. As Adam Yashari prepared to face the Serbs, his comrades urged him to escape.
Ademi kishte pasëm të gjuar këto fjalë dhe thot, bëni të fala batës Adem, po e kuptoj se çka je duke thonë. Mirë, po nëse unë do të largohem, atëherë rezistenca këtu nuk do të jetë aq e fuqishme sa duhet të jetë. Prandaj unë kam vendosur të mbetem këtu dhe do të rezistojmë dhe do të qëndrojmë deri te njeriu I fundit.
Ai ka qenë kategorik se unë nuk do të lëviz familjen nga shtëpia, nuk do t'i largoj.
Yashari had decided the KLA needed martyrs, and he and his family would provide them.
Yashari I mi smo imali problem što su oni kao taoce držali žene, decu I starce. Mi smo ih, policija ih je danima pozivala megafonom da puste taoce, da predaju oružje. Svaki sledeći pokušaj našeg prilaska stvarao je mogućnost da u redovima policije bude još više žrtava. I iz tog razloga je bilo neophodno da se koristi jedan deo artiljerijskih sredstava.
When all firing from the Yasharis had stopped, the Serbs entered the compound. The women and children left alive were hiding in a cellar. She was the only survivor. Yashari and 45 of his fighters and family were killed. 12 of the dead were women. 11 were young children. Yashari's death had the effect he intended. In Pristina, 100,000 turned out to back the KLA. Their protest was broken up by Serb police. The international community decided to act. 6 foreign ministers were called to London. They were the contact group, which had been created to settle arguments between Russia and the West during Milosevic's previous wars.
We met at Lancaster House in a room where we had met a number of times. And I said, gentlemen, remember that history is watching us, and our predecessors sat in this room and watched Bosnia burn.
The British and Americans were determined to reimpose the full range of economic sanctions against Milosevic.
У нас произошел очень тяжелый разговор с Мадленовым, брат. Почему вы требуете, чтобы мы бы разворачивали во все санкции? Почему мы загоняем в угол Югославию, которая идет на какие-то уступки?
The truth is, I was pretty obnoxious. I mean, I kept feeling that this was a crucial meeting and that we couldn't start giving away things early.
Аргументы однозначные, что Kosovo, геноцид, Kosovo, сербы там.
What I pressed Yevgeny on is that we really had to be seen to respond to what was happening within Kosovo. If we really wanted to change Milosevic's thinking, the most important, useful way to do it was the commercial sanctions.
Мы тогда пытались немного охладить пыл наших западных партнеров, потому что мы понимали, что принятие санкций, на что западные партнеры уповали, чего они требовали, это может еще больше ухудшить ситуацию.
Despite Russia's objections, the contact group imposed new economic sanctions on Serbia and demanded that Belgrade move towards giving autonomy to Kosovo.
Trenutka Milošević jednostavno kaže za Kosovo i Metohiju ne postoje nikakve koncesije i oko toga nema razgovora.
Ja želim da poručim albanskim liderima na Kosovu. Neka se manu belosvetskih dušebrižnika koji brinu svoje, a ne njihove brige.
The more Milosevic dismissed their demands, the more Kosovo Albanians turned to the KLA. The State Department decided it was time to make contact.
We realized that we were going to have to, first of all, find out who these KLA were, and secondly, somehow try to get them into the peace process. We assumed there must be a leadership there, but it was a little like the search for the Northwest Passage.
We went out looking for people to talk to. There were roadblocks everywhere. There was shooting in the area, but this was clearly in Albanian control.
As the Americans hoped, the KLA were tracking them and made a kind of contact in the first village they visited.
We went upstairs in the house to sit down, and we were talking to the village chief. And quite unexpectedly, a rather dashing man with a beard, carrying a weapon that looked larger than him, came and just jammed himself into the seat.
I'll come back and let you talk to us. If you want, we can talk here, we can go outside. But
there wasn't a lot of room, so he practically sat on Holbrook's lap as if Holbrook were Santa Claus.
In fact, the Americans had got no nearer to the KLA top brass. But the KLA had won valuable publicity. The picture went around the world, apparently showing Americans and KLA rubbing shoulders.
Za nas je bilo izuzetno iznenađenje činjenica da je gospodin Holbrook dopustio sebi da skine cipele i da bos u čarapama sedne sa teroristima i da razgovara.
The American president got an earful.
J'ai donc téléphoné à Bill Clinton, au président Clinton, pour lui faire part de mon étonnement et lui dire que je considérais que ce n'était pas là une initiative heureuse et que c'était le sentiment de l'ensemble de l'Union européenne.
But the Americans pressed on. A week later, Ambassador Holbrook used a conference in Switzerland as a cover for another assignation.
Varej si shmëthaj dhe Gjavit Haliti nga ky kontakt se çfarë rrjedhë do të marrë edhe përkrahja apo mos përkrahja, mbështetja apo mos mbështetja e ushtrisë shqiptare të Kosovës. Ishte përgjegjësi shumë e madhe për mua.
The man the KLA had chosen to speak for them was a refugee living with his family near Lausanne.
Shkova një orë diçka më herët se sa ora parapar për takim. Porosita një pije, isha nervos, pija duhan pandarpre.
We didn't know much about the KLA. Our intelligence didn't make it clear who was in charge of it, where they got their money, how it was organized, or even what they stood for.
Unë I tregova qartë se ushtria shkrimtare e Kosovës është për një Kosovë demokratike. Dhe e majta, e djatha, edhe e qendra si forca politike nuk mund të kenë kuptim në Kosovë ku fshatnat tona bombardohen sin të majtë, sin djathë, sin qendër.
Fighting for their lives was a difficult thing to do, and I understood that.
Më tha që në këtë procese sipër ne do të imponojmë fillimisht Milosevicit ndryshimet të tilla kushtetuare që 3 deri në 5 vjet më vonë ato ndryshime do të shkojnë në pavarësinë e Kosovës.
I may have suggested to Mahmoudi right away that was a possibility if they handled themselves correctly.
Even if independence was only a possibility, this was great news for the KLA. After the meeting, they set out to make themselves more user-friendly to the West.
Me antarët e shtabit përgjithshëm kur kam bisedu, kam kërkuar nga ata që urgjentisht të hiqen simbolet që identifikonin ushtarët tonë me komunistët. Të hiqen mjekrat, të hiqet grushti në përshëndetje dhe mundësisht të përshëndetet ashtu siç përshëndet ushtria amerikane.
During the summer of 1998, the KLA killed 80 Serb police and 60 civilians. They took over 2 towns and claimed they would soon liberate all of Kosovo. But the truth was, they didn't yet have a proper army. The Serbs did. They now targeted entire villages, driving people out and burning their homes.
Kad ulazite u selo i svih kuća, veliki zidovi, počne da se puca I tako dalje. Policija I vojska uvek u samoodbrani reaguje kako zna I ume da se sačuva I tako dalje. I tu je moguće da je bilo I prekoračenja.
Secretary Albright ordered me to go see Milosevic and to make it clear this absolutely had to stop. He told me that they were simply conducting operations against terrorism. I said, let me first tell you what I saw in Milosevic. I saw men in Serb uniforms putting television sets and other consumer goods into a trailer. I saw another man dressed in a Serb uniform with a can of liquid, spreading it in a store and lighting it with a match. At that point, he became very agitated. He stood up and began pacing, thrusting his hands in his pockets and saying, "It's unacceptable, it's unacceptable."
U svim tim operacijama svi naši pripadnici i vojske i policije znali su da je izuzetno važno i imali su naredbu o tome da ni na kakav način ne smeju biti povređeni civili.
The West had stood by before as Milosevic protested innocence while perpetrating ethnic cleansing. Now he was at it again. The Americans urged their allies to act.
I felt that we had learned something from Bosnia and had learned the terrible mistake you make once you realize you have an intransigent situation to just keep talking and fiddling around the edges.
J'ai dit à président Clinton qu'une intervention militaire dans un monde civilisé et organisé nécessitait un feu vert, une demande ou au moins un accord du Conseil de sécurité des Nations Unies.
It was evident that the Russians would veto a Security Council resolution and we would be paralyzed. And so what was the point of going down that road and finding that you had basically ended up in a blind alley?
The United Nations, which could authorize the use of force, adjourned for the summer without doing so. Milosevic drew his own conclusions. His forces launched an offensive which almost destroyed the KLA, and they did not stop there. By mid-September, it was reported that 100,000 ethnic Albanians had fled from the Serb police into the forests and hills of Kosovo. Russia could no longer resist a UN resolution calling on Milosevic to allow the refugees to return home. But the resolution contained no threat of force. The very next day, NATO's defence ministers assembled by the seaside in Portugal. It was the British who found an acceptable way to put teeth into the UN resolution.
What we needed to do there was to put in place some action to back up the United Nations resolution and to stop the horrors that were actually playing every half hour on the television that day in the hotel. And I said in my opening intervention, there's the list of demands. He has got to withdraw the number of troops. He's got to stop the disproportionate violence. He's got to do a whole variety of things laid down by the United Nations. If he doesn't do that, we know the United Nations cannot move. So NATO will move. NATO will say, or else.
Und mit dieser Formel, die die Briten immer wieder in sehr eleganter, subtiler Weise eingebracht haben, ist es am Ende dann auch gelungen, die Bedenken Frankreichs zu beseitigen. Briten bauten die Brücke, über die wir dann gemeinsam gehen konnten.
Just a few moments ago, the North Atlantic Council approved the issue of the Act 1 for both a limited air option and a phased air campaign in Kosovo.
In Belgrade, Milosevic summoned his Supreme Defense Council. He faced a mutiny.
Ja sam na to rekao da mi smo dosta toga uradili, ako treba još nešto da uradimo i da potpuno ispunimo rezoluciju, da to objavimo i da to, da tako kažem, bude naš osnovni politički stav.
Ja sam Miloševića upozoravao da će Zapad, ako se ne ispune odredbe rezolucije 1199, preduzeti mere da bombama reši problem.
Imao sam utisak da takav ton nipošto nije odgovarao gospodinu Miloševiću, pošto je on, ja mislim, bio ušao u fazu u kojoj je sumnjičio spremnost međunarodne zajednice i NATO pakta da realizuju svoje ratne prijetnje Saveznoj Republici Jugoslaviji. Naime, Miloševićevi komentari su Pa šta, dogodit će se bombardovanje, pa posle toga će opet biti mir, bit će bombardovanje 5 ili 7 dana, nakon toga će se mobilisati međunarodna zajednica, NATO pakt će morati odustati od takve svoje namjere i mi ćemo onda biti moralni pobjednici.
Overruling his colleagues, Milosevic dismissed NATO as a paper tiger. In Brussels, America's special envoy asked the NATO Council for a show of force to convince Milosevic they meant business.
I requested an immediate activation order. Now, an activation order means that you turn the planes over to the Supreme Commander and let him launch whenever he wants to. And it is the next to last step before the use of force.
The order gave Milosevic 96 hours to comply with all the demands in the UN resolution.
We then moved B-52s forward from the United States to Britain. We put planes on the runway in Aviano, gassed up and ready to go. We were not bluffing. We were hours away from launch.
Faced with the display of force, Milosevic caved in.
Bila je uočljiva briga kod samog Miloševića, obzirom na potpuno jasnu, izraženu, neskrivenu pretnju da je bombardovanje veoma blizu.
Milosevic agreed to all the West's demands, including the withdrawal of some of his forces from Kosovo.
We never asked the KLA to do anything. We never asked the KLA to sign anything. The pressure was all on Belgrade.
Mi smo to naređenje ispoštovali, morali smo da ga ispoštujemo, jednostavno prepustili smo jedan deo teritorije Albancima. Što su oni iskoristili, znači oni nisu ispoštovali prekid vatre.
Ka qenë gëzimi madh, ka qenë ma shumë se ndihmë në atë për neve. Me marrëveshjen që e kanë shkuar, Serbë nuk kanë guxuar me hyje dhe ne kemi pas lirë për veprim.
The international team appointed to monitor the ceasefire were powerless to stop them.
We were possibly the only people in Kosovo that didn't have arms. But there we were between these two forces trying to keep them apart. They were heavily armed. They were willing to use those arms. And eventually we worried that they would maybe turn their arms on us, thinking that we had somehow were leaning in the opposite direction.
Some of the monitors did lean, and mostly one way.
Ndihmën që na kanë ofruar kanë qenë hartat me të cilat janë shërbyer vet ata. Është diçka që neve na kanë dashur në atë kohë, na kanë dashur për matjen e koordinimit në koordinatave dhe shumë gjëra tjera që i vjen çdo ushtri. Na nuk kemi marrë asnjëherë ndonjë sulm serioz sepse s'kemi pas fuqi, s'kemi pas prellat me na jesë, s'kemi pas. Mirë, po kemi shumë me ngacmuar që ata me na sulmuan neve. Kështu që kemi ngacmuar kryesisht me snajper. Coku jon çka tani më rrin këtë kohë është që NATO janë ndërhynte sa më shpejt.
The Serbs rose to the bait. In early January 1999, the KLA shot dead 3 Serb policemen. The Serb response in the village of Račak would change everything.
Mi smo imali izveštaje o jednoj familiji iz sela Račak koja je bila odgovorna za ubistvo 3 policajca. Dobili smo naređenje od pretpostavljene komande da pripremimo akciju za uništenje terorista koji su se tu nalazili. Mi smo u akciju krenuli u 2 sata ujutru. Vreme je bilo vrlo hladno, zemlja je bila zaleđena, mrak je bio. Znali smo da u takvoj akciji lavež pasa može da upropasti celu akciju. Na sreću, to malo što je ostalo, verovatno se zbog hladnoće sklonilo u neka toplija mesta.
Many of the villagers had already left Ratchak.
Mi smo se kretali kroz šumu I došli smo do njihovih rovova. Došlo je do kratke borbe u kojoj su naše jedinice uspjele da likvidiraju te ljude koji su dežurali u rovovima. To je već bilo u osvit zore I došlo je do borbe.
For 6 hours, the paramilitary police fired into the village from one end, while army units bombarded it from the other. Then they moved in. The Serb force reported finding the bodies of 15 Albanian men in the village. The Serb major says that after searching from house to house, he left a small unit to stand guard overnight.
I u toku noći su oni napustili položaj. Iz kog razloga to rečeno je da su se bili uplašili.
When the head of the monitoring team arrived at work next morning, one of his deputies was waiting for him.
I remember him saying, "I'm sorry, sir, but I think something else has happened up there, and it might be something pretty bad." So we drove down the highway to the village.
By the time Ambassador Walker entered the village, some KLA men had returned.
I was told that if you want to see what happened yesterday, you go up this ravine. We came on the first body. Jesus Christ. There was no head on this body. It was just the neck and...
Let's give him the dignity of covering him up.
As we walked up the ravine, we came on a pile of bodies, in which, I don't know, there must have been 10 to 15 bodies, all piled on top of each other.
The Serb police claimed the dead were KLA members killed in the battle, and that fellow KLA men had replaced their uniforms with peasant clothes to make them look like civilians. Ambassador Walker was sure he saw evidence to the contrary.
I noticed blood-stained clothes where the bullets had entered, and the blood stains were around the wound. I found it impossible to believe that the blood stains had somehow been put in just the right place.
Walker decided to give the world his verdict.
From what I personally saw, I do not hesitate to describe the event as a massacre, obviously a crime very much against humanity.
I felt that what I had seen was a horror, and that it was in fact perpetrated by the security forces from Belgrade.
This was the kind of hard evidence the Americans had been waiting for. For months, the Secretary of State had been urging her allies to use force against Milosevic. Now she seized her opportunity.
It's terrible to think that something like a massacre can actually galvanize people to action. The truth is, something terrible happened, and the question then was what to do next.
I made clear that I thought this justified an immediate military response. Now, the Europeans were not ready to do that.
America's allies feared that Mrs. Albright wanted to bounce them into war. They needed a strategy of their own. France's president phoned London.
J'ai dit à Tony Blair que le premier pas dans cette nouvelle stratégie, c'était la réunion du groupe de contact. Alors pourquoi la réunion du groupe de contact? tout simplement parce que dans le groupe de contact, il y avait la Russie.
Jacques Chirac and I were both very conscious of the fact that the Russians obviously were in a different position because of their closeness to the Serbs.
Et je savais parfaitement que Mme Albright, personne brillante, mais dont le caractère n'était pas toujours facile, était réservée à l'égard de la réunion du groupe de contact, parce qu'elle ne voulait pas siéger avec les Russes ou discuter avec les Russes. Et donc j'ai dit à Tony Blair que nous devions vaincre la réticence de Mme Albright.
The problem always was in the contact group meetings that the Western allies would say, we can't do anything because the Russians won't move. And so I went to Moscow.
In an attempt to outflank her European colleagues, she went straight to the Russian foreign minister.
When we got together, we always tried to do something nice in addition to having the hard discussions. So he had invited me to the Bolshoi. It was really an amazing scene to sit in the Tsar's box with the Russian foreign minister, and the whole place was full of red velvet and gold, and I thought, a perfect outfit for this, which was also long velvet. People actually turned around to look at the two foreign ministers together.
В Большом театре мы, конечно, обсуждали это только в перерыве или уже на выходе, потому что мы пошли в Большой театр не обсуждать эту тему.
I decided to take a calculated risk to lay out our strategy that we would have to be prepared to use force.
Или когда по мере поступления информации госсекретарь ставил вопрос, что необходимо принять какие-то меры.
I think that Ivanov was quite surprised.
And he in turn surprised her.
Ivanov made clear that he was tired of having Russia appear always to defend Milosevic, that he agreed that if anything was ever going to work, it was going to require the use of force, but he told her quite candidly he could never say that publicly.
Having that kind of assurance, we were in a position to issue some kind of an ultimatum.
The French and British leaders were determined to prevent Mrs. Albright using the ultimatum as a shortcut to war. They wanted to use it to force Milosevic to change his policy in Kosovo.
Tony Blair m'avait invité à dîner au Downing Street. Et je lui ai dit, je serais très content d'embrasser Cheryl et les enfants. Donc, nous sommes allés dans la partie de son appartement.
It was a really informal evening, and it was very important that because it was just at that crucial moment when we had to be on the same wavelength.
Alors, j'ai dit à Tony Blair qu'il fallait faire une dernière tentative de nature politique.
The consequence of these threats are so serious in terms of the military action. For goodness sake, let's give it another try with the political process. Let's stick the people together, get all the pressure we can on both sides to come around the table and try and sort it out.
They invited the parties to a peace conference at the Chateau of Rambouillet, 30 miles from Paris, which Louis XVI had used as his hunting lodge. But who would turn up? The Kosovar Albanian delegation arrived, among them a poet, a newspaper editor, and 7 men from the KLA. But as the delegates assembled for the French president's welcoming address, there was someone missing from the Serb delegation. Slobodan Milosevic. When the invitation reached Belgrade, he had consulted a few close colleagues.
To je naveče bilo, čiji on je već bio faktički kući, da je ceo Rambouillet, već tada je rekao da je ceo Rambouillet smišljen kao opravdanje za početak agresije, da mi imamo mali prostor da tu reku ne prođemo i da se spasimo, da ne dođe do bombardovanja Jugoslavije i da ako je taj mali prostor treba ga učiniti, evo i da Milutinović ode u Rambouillet.
By sending his number 2, the president of Serbia, Milosevic left himself room for maneuver, but soon after the conference began, his stand-in learnt that the Western leaders insisted any settlement must be policed by NATO troops.
Da trupe NATO-a mogu bez ikakve restrikcije ići kroz celu teritoriju Jugoslavije, da mogu bez naknade ulaziti i izlaziti, bez carine, bez pregleda, bez sudske odgovornosti, da mogu bez naknade koristiti sve naše vojne kapacitete i tako dalje. I naravno ja sam reagovao da taj deo sporazuma je za nas na takav način neprihvatljiv.
That evening, as the American negotiator briefed his Secretary of State in her suite, he received a note.
I got a message that Milutinovic wanted to meet with me in the Bristol Hotel. In the piano bar.
Normalno je da na takim konferencijama mora ostati jedan istorijski trag. Piano baru, znate kako, svira muzika pa sve lakše.
The Serb president wanted privacy to pursue Milosevic's pet idea. Ever since he had signed the peace with world leaders in Paris, he had harbored a secret ambition. Now it was revealed.
Ja sam rekao, Kriz, najbolje budem u NATO.
I said, Milan, I think you've misunderstood something, but go on.
Sam to bio vrlo precizan. Ali da to bude normalan ugovor kao što imate sa drugim zemljama, NATO zemljama, komercijalni ugovor.
I said, Milan, I'm telling you, there is a point at which we could find NATO in action against your country.
Kilje je imao više jedan stav otprilike, ma Milane, pa što ste zapili toliko za tim Kosovom? Pa to je jedna crna rupa, šta će vam to? Bolje se oslobodite te bede.
Milan, we don't have years. We're talking weeks. We're talking days. This has got to move ahead.
The Americans put more effort into winning over the Kosovo Albanians. The Secretary of State needed them to sign up to the contact group's terms if she was to persuade her colleagues to act against Milosevic. She focused her attention on the young KLA man who had become delegation leader, Hashim Thaçi.
He presented his perspective about democracy and multi-ethnic cultures. You know, he looks like a leader. He's a very tall, handsome young man, quite urbane looking.
Takimin që e kishëm ndarës, në fillim ishte programuar për 5 minuta, zgjati rreth 25 minuta gjysmore. Ne diskutuam për domosdoshmërinë e zgjidhjes politike.
Mrs. Albright was confident that she would accept the terms on offer, even though they promised Kosovo only autonomy within Serbia, not the independence the KLA was fighting for. But she didn't realize the pressure the KLA leader was under from home.
Edhe I kemi marrë në telefon gjithë antarët e grupit negociator që janë konë atë. Edhe ju kemi kërcënuar se nuk guxoni më nënshkruar.
Por edhe në Kosovë ishte krijuar një opinion se gjoja atje delegacioni shqiptar është duke trautuar.
Më kujtohet se sot kur njëri prej tyre I kam thonë se ju e dini se kemi raketa kundërajrit edhe do t'i ruajmë ato raketa, do t'i përdorim më sër po aeroplane ju po zbritën Slatin do ta rrezojmë nëse nënshkruani.
The KLA were demanding a referendum on independence, certain that the Albanian majority would vote for it. After 2 weeks of work on the details, the foreign ministers arrived for the final session. First, they summoned the Kosovo-Albanian delegation.
The foreign ministers all sat at a long table, as if we were in judgment or something. And first Thaçi was brought in with a couple of other members of the Albanian delegation.
Kishte ardhur momenti që ne të themi thjesht po ose jo dokumentit, gjë që me të vërtetë ishte mjaft e rëndë.
The question was basically, do you agree with the framework, yes or no? And we were expecting a yes, or I was.
Dokumenti ishte kundër pavarësisë, nuk përfshihej referendumi, por në njëjtën kohë gjë për cilën edhe kishin luftuar, shumë njerëz kishin vrarë, shumë njerëz. Përgjigjja ime ka qenë, ne shkruajmë dokumentin, por në dokument duhet përfshihet referendumi.
He needed further improvements, and of course the improvements he wanted were ones that we knew were unnegotiable, they were impossible to get agreement on. And eventually I had to say to him, look, the bottom line here, the real question is, can you say yes to this package?
Ishte një situatë e rrezikshme. Për ne, posaçërisht nga se dini, ministri italian insistonte të na zinte për çdo fjalë dhe e bënte këtë me mjeshtri.
Io dissi che su questo ci voleva, come Robin Cook, ci voleva una risposta chiara e netta, che era sì o era no.
Dhe dia se po që se ne i themi jo këtij dokumenti, ne do të humbisnim mbështetjen ndërkombëtare, problemi i Kosovës do të qitej në harres, ky problem do të kurdizoj.
When he wouldn't say yes, I remember taking off my earphones, just putting them down on the table in just pure exasperation.
She didn't like, in particolare, la mia insistenza di conoscere esattamente qual era la posizione kosovara.
I thought that the way that the language had been constructed provided what in diplomacy we call some creative ambiguity.
E io ho detto, certamente una certa ambiguità nella fraseologia che si mette negli accordi è necessaria, ma qui si decideva se bombardare o non bombardare la Serbia, che era una decisione di una tale importanza che dovevamo essere assolutamente certi che la responsabilità del mancato accordo era della Serbia e che non era dei kosovari.
Dini got more and more insistent and said, "Are you willing to give up independence?"
Tha që ajo nuk mund të pranojmë, edhe atëherë u kthy ka Madeleine Albright dhe tha, you see, this is what I told you. Nuk I tha kështu me fjalë, mirë po shikimi ishte, you see, I told you so.
Ma c'era grande nervosismo nella delegazione americana perché la strategia che gli americani avevano portato avanti e sviluppato era fallita.
The Serbs also failed to accept the terms, but Mrs. Albright's anger was directed at the KLA leader.
I said, "Look, you have let us down. It is an impossible situation now. How could you do this? We expected you to be a leader."
Zonja Albright ka deklaruar se po që se ju nënshkruani, serbët nuk nënshkruajnë, ne do të bombardojmë. Ne do të aktivizohemi. Po që se ju nuk nënshkruani, serbët e pranojnë, ne kemi duart e lidhura.
He looked like a high school student that I had dressed down.
Edhe të nesërmen është rritur presioni që të pranojmë atë dokument pa referendum.
The Kosovo Albanians were given 3 more days. Torn between the Americans and the gunmen back home, for 72 hours they shut themselves up in their meeting room and agonized over the decision. 5 minutes before the deadline, they were still arguing among themselves when the door opened.
Dhe Chris Hilli mriti I tëri gjersitur, kravata e hapur, s'kishte fjet aq sa disa prej nesh.
I said, "So, are you going to sign this thing or are you not?" At that point, Saroy spoke up.
Këto 2 javë, 3 javë po I kalojmë negociata. Këto 10 vjet po I kalojmë konflikt me Milosevic. Edhe po vjen një moment, I vetëmi moment, kur krejt këto po mundemi me gjujt, edhe jemi të gjujt. Edhe për mu ka qenë sekondat të cilat ne po e gjujmë krejt mundin ton, vetëm se nuk mund të gjejmë një formulim shumë të thjeshtë.
Veton Saroy had a brainwave. The document they were being asked to sign said, in 3 years, an international meeting would consider a final settlement for Kosovo, and the will of the people would be taken into account. Saroy suggested they could sign it if Mrs. Albright accepted a letter stating that the will of the people would be tested in a referendum.
Pra, faktikisht e qilnim derën për një lloj referendumi politik, por njëkohësisht I thoshim bashkisë ndërkombëtare se sa I përket nesh, puna me këtë dokument ka përfunduar.
Thatcher was trying to read the draft on his translator's computer screen.
And I have Jim O'Brien and Jamie Rubin behind, telling me, hurry up, man, hurry up. You can read it later.
And Hashim was saying, well, maybe you could change that. And I said, no, you can't change. And I began to step in front of him and sort of bump him back away from the computer. I want it done.
Kemi pritur shumë kohë, kemi biseduar shumë gjatë dhe 1 minutë nuk do të na kushtoj asgjë.
O'Brien just takes a sheet of paper, knowing that if the paper remains a few more minutes in Fauci's possession, he would probably change his mind.
I said, Jamie, here's a copy. You're going to announce this.
I thought that I better first check with the Secretary of State, and I snuck into the conference room and whispered in her ear what had happened, and she said, go out and announce it.
The letter was addressed to Mrs. Albright, so she was able to accept the referendum compromise without consulting her colleagues.
Then I really started to get my blood pumping, and I began running through the halls of this crazy castle and out through the gates and into the town square to finally tell the reporters something good. Very briefly, the Kosovo Albanian delegation has voted in favor of this agreement, pending consultations with the people of Kosovo. The Albanians had chosen peace and deferred independence, and the Serbs had not, and now there was clarity that the world needed in deciding whose side they should be on.
With a referendum in the bag, Thatcher won over the commanders back home. The delegation returned to Paris for the signing ceremony. Milosevic stayed home, claiming foul play.
What was tried to be imposed in Rambouillet was not autonomy at all. That was independence. And I really don't believe, if you show it to any honest American, that there is one single honest American who will tell you that if they were on the place of our delegation, would sign that.
Serbia's parliament duly backed Milosevic's rejection of the Rambouillet terms, as did the Serb public. Serbia's deputy prime minister revealed what Milosevic was planning to do next.
Ako dođe do bombardovanja od strane NATO pakta, ako dođe do američke agresije, mi Srbi ćemo prilično stradati, ali Albanaca na Kosovu neće biti.